Hello and welcome to another episode of Protest and Promise. I'm your host, Lisa Salazar, General Manager of the Youth Development Department. As you know, our department was established by the City Council in 2021 to create a greater connection between youth and their city. As part of our efforts to improve the quality of life of young Angelenos, we are working in partnership with Channel 35 to bring you Protest and Promise, giving our youth a platform and a voice to discuss the issues affecting them today. Today we have a special program and guest in the studio with us, Jenna Hornstock, Housing Director for the Southern California Association of Governments here in Los Angeles. We're going to chat with Jenna and members of our very own LA City Youth Council about housing policy, zoning, and homelessness, and how they are all interconnected. As of the latest LAHSA data presented in 2020, there are a total of 41,000 homeless individuals in the city of Los Angeles. Of those, about 4,700 were under the age of 24. This shows just how important it is to understand the symptoms of this growing issue. So, Jenna, welcome to the studio and welcome to Protest and Promise. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'd love to start with just a basic question and getting to know you and a little bit about your career path and how you got to be in the position that you're in today. So if you could just share that with our audience.
Sure. So in terms of my background and why I feel so fortunate to be here today, I actually worked for the mayor of LA right out of grad school.
Which mayor?
Mayor Han.
Okay.
In 2002, and I actually was fortunate to staff the committee that formed the first housing trust fund. So it was bringing monies together that could fund affordable housing. From there, I actually worked for a minute for a nonprofit affordable housing developer. We did transitional housing, emergency shelters, and permanent affordable housing. But then I found one of my true loves working for the redevelopment agency here in Los Angeles, and it's a longer history. We no longer have redevelopment here, but when I did that work, I just got to touch on so many things. We worked at the neighborhood level, so we worked with community to talk about the needs in the community, but we got to buy land, we got to put money into affordable housing deals, we got to work on land use planning, and then all the things around it, community facilities, healthcare, open space. And so for me, that was a really formative experience in how I think about land use and planning.
That's really great.
Yeah.
Sharing your story about how you evolved to this place that you're in today and kind of showing that career pathway. Because I think a lot of times young people don't always realize that you kind of get to where you are by doing a lot of different things and understanding and seeing what you're really passionate about and then being in a position like you are to affect change. So thank you for sharing that. Sure. So you're with Skag for our viewing audience who are primarily young people. Yeah. Can you help us understand a little bit about what Skag is and what Skag does? This would be really great context.
Yeah, so Skag is the Southern California Association of Governments. And what that is we are something called an MPO, a Metropolitan Planning Organization. And MPOs are actually required by federal law for any urbanized area with over 50,000 people. Wow. Now, Skag, so across the country there are MPOs. We are the largest in the whole country because we cover 6 counties. We cover about half the state in Southern California. And our responsibilities, what we mainly do, comes from state and federal law. So there's a host of things that we do, but really we work with stakeholders. So we work with local governments, we work with tribal governments and business and philanthropy and nonprofits. And what we do is we develop a long-range visioning plan that sets forth how we're going to grow as a region, and in particular, how we're going to have mobility options and enough housing to grow. And we have to show how we're going to grow in a way that reduces greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. That's really great. And yeah, I could see how we could be the largest in the country. I mean, LA County alone is like 10 million, no, is it like 10 million people?
It's 10 million, about 10 million.
10 million,
LA
you add
City,
Riverside and
Yeah, we're Ventura, LA, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Imperial County, which really is right near the border of
Really
Mexico.
big and so important to have that regional approach because homelessness, traffic, air pollution, they don't know boundaries, right? So having a regional approach is a really smart way to address this issue.
Yeah.
So thank you for that context. It's perfect. So we are joined today by members of our LA City Youth Council. We have 6 young people here with us today via Zoom who are very interested in housing policy and understanding this complex issue and what are some of the kind of, I would say, solutions that are underway and just to really help them understand where this region is going. So we have 6 young people on the line. They have lots of questions, and let's jump right in. So, Monica, why don't you just quickly introduce yourself and ask Jenna your question.
Sure. Hi, Jenna. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us today. I'm Monica Rodriguez, and I'm one of the 2 youth representing City District 8. So oftentimes, youth are left out of important conversations such as affordable housing, which is really detrimental considering that LA has some of like the top colleges and universities that really only offer guaranteed housing for freshmen. And even then, it can still be quite expensive, especially for natives. On top of that, we also have a lot of youth who may have just left the foster care system or even incarceration. So they need like accessible and affordable housing. So my question to you is, what programs do you provide for youth outreach? Whether it's collecting their input, reaching out to them for the application process, or just involvement with city planning?
Sure. So that's a good question, and I think it ties in really well, Monica, to understanding what Skag does as an MPO, as like a regional entity. So first of all, I just want to reiterate that housing and addressing the housing crisis is one of the most important things to us at Skag. What we tend to do is help our cities with access to resources and best practices so that they can work more locally. We have to work bottoms up because land use planning and investing in the housing that you're talking about and doing the land use planning to produce that housing, it happens at the city level primarily and sometimes at the county level. So we don't have control over that, but what we do is we work with our cities to provide them resources. Like we run grant funds. Right now, I am so fortunate to be with a team working on $150 million worth of grant programs, all focused on getting more housing and more housing built at the city level. But in terms of engagement, some of the work that we're really proud of is we've been doing more work to partner with community-based organizations in communities so that they can then reflect the voices of the folks that they're working with youth being, really important, is lifting up younger voices. And so we've launched a couple different efforts and grants specifically funding community-based organizations working on housing and housing policy and land use. So again, covering half the state. It's hard for us to get way down at the level of individual cities and youth, but we're trying to use our capacity with resources to help folks who are working on the ground to engage better.
So engagement with community-based organizations.
Yeah.
That's really good at the community level. Monica, thank you for that question.
Thank you.
How about you, Zaid? You have a question for Jenna?
Yeah, good afternoon, Jenna. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Zaid. I am the Youth Council member for District 2, which encompasses part of the San Fernando Valley, including North Hollywood, where I call home. But my question for you today is, so the state budget, the California state budget for the fiscal year of 2021 to 2022 includes over $22 billion in funding for programs that address the state's housing and homelessness needs. In addition to funding for programs, the budget also includes $4.3 million for the newly launched Housing Accountability Unit at the State Department of Housing and Community Development. So I was wondering if you can please explain how Skag hopes to work within these budget priorities and housing policies in order to implement permanent long-term housing for persons experiencing homelessness through Los Angeles and the greater Southern California region.
Sure, that's a great question. So one of the reasons I'm actually at Skag and I'm excited to work with my team is that through a couple of different state budgets, the most recent one you noted, but also the one prior, we, for the first time, have all these resources to provide grants to cities and develop programs specifically to support accelerating housing production, to do land use planning work. I talked about some of this engagement work, and with the budget you just mentioned, I can't remember the number, it was a big number, 23 billion, I think you said. Within that, there's a $600 million program called the Regional Early Action Planning Grant, REAP, of 2021. We are right now doing programming. Our Skag, because we're so large, is getting $246 million. And in that, just over 100 million is going toward housing programs. And our team right now is lifting up what those programs are. We're actually deep in a community engagement process, community and stakeholder engagement. But I can give you some sense of where we're at. One of the things we'll be doing is funding trust funds, housing trust funds. So folks that work at a sub-regional level, sometimes they cover a couple cities or one city or a county, and they provide funding to build housing. So that's one way we're trying to push the money down. We're also going to continue one thing we do often, which is funding cities to do their land use planning, because we haven't talked a ton about land use planning, but we in Southern California have over the last 50 or 60 years made choices to not allow as much housing to be built. And that's one of the reasons we have our housing crisis. And so we're trying to work with cities that want to change their zoning to allow for that. So we're putting some money out for that. We'll be having another grant program for community participation in this work. And also we're going to lift up a technical assistance program to help to help any public agency that wants to develop their own land for affordable housing. So those are just a couple of the programs that we're launching with this gift of funding that we're getting in the budget.
That's really good. So I heard land use planning, affordable housing, housing trust funds, the REAP program. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Zaid, thank you for that question. How about you, Charlie?
Hi, thank you guys for having me today, and thank you, Jenna, for joining us. So I believe oftentimes people don't really understand how affordable housing is built. And so could you explain Skag's role, if they have one, and the city's role in building affordable housing? And what role does Skag, if they do have one, play in permitting developments of the new constructions?
Sure. I'm going to start with Skag and kind of where we show up in the housing space primarily. And I should note, our role was really different until a few years ago. I mentioned all this new budget funding, and I just want to applaud the state for their commitment to funding housing and all the different ways it shows up. Because it takes more than just building housing to address the housing crisis. There's all the reasons that we got here today, including the land use planning. So traditionally, our role has been through something called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA. And what that is the state does work and they give us a number, and they say, this is the number of housing units that needs to be built in your region, our 6-county region. And it's Skag's job to take that number, and we have, not myself, but we have PhD demographers and economists and people who know how to run models and numbers, and we come up with a methodology, and we try to look at access to jobs and transit, and we look at social equity factors, and we take that 1.3 million number, our target for new housing, and we give every city and county in our region a number, and that's their goal for producing housing. And you mentioned, I think Zaid mentioned this new housing accountability unit. They're meaning business. Like, they're telling cities and counties, we're going to be watching you, right? You're going to meet those numbers. So it's an interesting role for Skag. We really try to take a bottoms-up approach, but that number can cause a lot of discussion. I think that's what I'll say, healthy discussion and debate with our city. So that's our main role. And then with this new funding, we're fleshing out money to help cities meet those goals. But I think you hit on an important point. We don't have we don't build the housing or even put the money directly in the deals. So in terms of affordable housing, it's primarily cities and counties, those who have land use control, who have to have the zoning in place. Usually with affordable housing, there's a subsidy, right? The market doesn't just build it and keep rents low. So the cities and the counties tend to run programs where they take federal money and state money and their own money and put it in to make the deals affordable, to keep the rents lower. So that's really happening at the city level and at the county level. And then we try to come in with resources and support that work and bring best practices forward.
Great question. It really helps me understand, the milestones that are set and the rules around that and the accountability factor. Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie, for that question. Roberto, please.
Hi, Jenna. My name is Roberto Lopez. I'm a youth council member representing District 7. And just an observation of mine, individuals who end up homeless tend to stay in areas that they have previously lived in before. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those areas are rich in service. So how do zoning laws play a role in determining what areas receive more affordable housing or shelters than others?
That's a really, really interesting, and wow, that is like a complicated question. I feel like you could write a whole dissertation on that. I'm gonna give you my thoughts on that, but I want to note there's probably a lot more that goes into it. So, you know, you've probably in your work and your thinking like talked about things like our institutional and systemic racism and how it shows up in land use planning and zoning. And one of the ways it has shown up is that in communities where you have high homeownership rates, a lot of those folks don't want to see apartments for whatever reason. There was long time association of folks living in apartments that can't afford to buy a home are not folks that we want in our neighborhood. So we don't want to have apartments in our neighborhood. And so they would take means to make sure that couldn't happen. Now, most affordable housing that gets built, they're apartments. Or sometimes it's just apartment is cheaper than buying a house. So there's affordable housing that has a subsidy, and then there's just regular housing that, not anymore in LA, but there used to be regular rental housing that maybe was more affordable. And so what would happen is neighborhoods where maybe there was less political power, which tended to be communities of color, communities where people are lower income and just don't have the same political agility, access, they would get the apartments, right? So that's kind of one story of the housing, and it was easier to put the affordable housing there because nobody was fighting it, if you will. I do think, so that's one of like many other factors that go into it. I mean, another one is just land is more expensive in neighborhoods that are more desirable, in quotes, whatever desirable means at that moment. And so if you're trying to do affordable housing and it's so hard to make your project pencil, right? Pencil is a word we use. Can you financially build the project? So sometimes you could find land that's cheaper in neighborhoods that are considered, less desirable for any number of reasons. So that's another reason. I mean, there's a host of them, but it kind of all, works together in these forces that have left some of what we call these high opportunity neighborhoods that maybe have better access to schools and parks and amenities, not being as many the places where we see the affordable housing. I should note there's a concerted effort to change that narrative and to change that reality. And so everybody is working on it. And again, I'm going to go back to Zaid and the state. The way the state is mandating housing planning to happen, they are talking about that. How do we do something called affirmatively further fair housing, AFFH? And it talks about getting affordable housing into those higher resourced areas. So I'm sorry, that was a very complicated question, so you got a complicated answer. But
yeah, I mean, it reminds me of like, a lot of things that you see in the news about folks that are saying, not in my backyard, this whole like NIMBY, kind of narrative. And I mean, it's an important question. And how do we change that narrative so that folks are open to affordable housing in places that people want to live? You want to live in the city of Los Angeles, you should be able to afford housing. And so great question, Roberto. Thank you for that. Christine, introduce yourself and please ask your question.
Hi, Jenna. My name is Christine Cohen. I am one of the youth representatives for Council District 13. My question is, what are the challenges that are faced by Skag when trying to implement proposed policies or programs that aid homelessness and affordable housing, and how can the youth help combat these barriers?
Great. So first of all, that's my home district. I live in District 13, so hi. Though I love them all. I love it all. Again, I think first off, just some of the challenges in general are kind of these themes we've been talking about, which Skag is a regional entity and we don't directly have the land use controller. We don't directly put the money into the projects. So we do have a lot of power as a convener when we're lucky as a funder. But I mean, we have 86 elected officials that make up our regional council, and then policy committees of about 40 elected officials. So every month we have this huge audience to talk about best practices and talk about what can we do. And that might sound okay, but what does that do? But it really does make a difference when we can bring best practices forward and say, what are other cities doing to combat homelessness or build more housing? And then how can we provide you with assistance if you want to do that, if your city wants to learn what this other city did. So I think it's an important way, again, as a regional entity, to make it so that each city doesn't have to reinvent the wheel and think of it on their own.
Best practices are a great way to go. I mean, when tackling just about any policy issue. I mean, if it works somewhere else, why not try it out in your own city? So that's really great that you all bring those best practices together, elevate them, and share them out so that cities can take a look and see if that might be an option for them. Great question, Christine. Thank you for that. Daniela, welcome to the show.
Hi. Hi, Jenna. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Daniela Sestich, and I'm one of the youth council members for CD15. And my question is geared towards more of the legislation and advocacy side of Skag.
Okay.
So it's about the housing first principle, and which is basically the idea that housing is a basic human right, for anyone watching that may not know, and that governing bodies that provide affordable housing, shelters, etc., should remove barriers for unhoused individuals to receive housing, a large one being that they must be clean of intoxicants so that they are deemed socially acceptable. And then from there, once individuals are actually given housing, then they can be given resources to actually reintegrate them into society. And so going forward with LA's affordable housing efforts, Southern California, are there prospects for Skag to advocate for this type of approach? Is it something on Skag's radar? And if not, could you walk us through some of the legislative agenda that Skag does have?
Sure. So at this moment, Skag hasn't taken a formal position on housing first or not, although I should say just last week, we had a presentation from a really successful housing first entity in Ventura. So again, this best practices idea brought forward. The way we tend to work with legislative advocacy, we actually have a legislative affairs department. So if that's anything that the youth are interested in, it's an amazing route to go. If you're interested in policy, and we keep track of bills, right? We have this amazing bill tracker. And in particular, what happens is all the housing bills, staff will take a look, we'll give some notes or thoughts about them. And then our chair of our legislative committee, which is an elected official from the region right now, she's from Yorba Linda. Peggy Wong she's a council member in Yorba Linda, which is Orange County. They decide what bills they want to take up and take a position on. Last year, our president wanted us to get more involved in housing legislation. We hadn't gotten that involved in it prior. And a big thing our cities wanted to see was more funding in a program called the Infill Infrastructure Grant. And it's, again, this gets deep in the weeds about how hard is it to deliver housing, but especially in LA City, which is really built out, right? You see stuff everywhere here. We were built out a long time ago, and to build housing, you need to do things like upgrade the sewer lines and the electricity, and how do you provide water, which that's a whole other topic, right? And cities will say, and what happens is each individual housing project ends up having to do upgrades to make this work. Wow. And it's not sexy stuff, right? Nobody's excited about funding sewer. Like, you're not having a big party when that happens at a groundbreaking. So this Infill Infrastructure Grant through the state provides funding to projects that invest in these utilities if they help build housing. So again, we're made up of city council folks who are thinking kind of deep in the weeds about how do we make it easier for cities. And so we were advocating for a lot more money in that program. We actually asked for $5 billion. I think the governor put about $250 billion. I'm going to go back to the budget. Our budget expert, Zaid, if he knows, maybe he can pull up the number, but I want to say there was about $250 million put in. So a lot of our legislative agenda is driven by kind of the interests of our committee members. But people do take meetings with us, and they advocate for us to take positions or not, and they can.
Wow, that's really interesting on how Skag can organize six counties and create legislative priorities that you all go after. And it's also interesting to learn how the state is working with Skag to incentivize cities who need to invest in upgrading their infrastructure. So great question, Daniela. Thank you for that. Yeah. So we probably have time for maybe one more question. Does anybody have a follow-up question that they'd like to ask? Oh, Monica put her hand up first, so if there was a buzzer, Monica, you hit it. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I was going through the Skag website and I saw that there was the Special Committee on Equity and Social Justice that will advise the Regional Council on Policies and Practices. And there were a ton of like awesome proposed activities, such as establishing an agency-wide definition of equity to build shared understanding, develop an equity inventory report, which would catalog Skag's existing equity-related activities, and so much more. And I also actually read through the report that was attached on that page. But as I continued to look through the site, I was unable to find kind of like what actions had actually like already been taken and implemented, or the outcomes/results of those proposed activities. So since the report was published, what activities has Skag taken to promote equity and social justice, and how have they modified their policies and practices at Skag?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you were able to find things on our website. It's a very dense website. So that special committee, gosh, I had just started Skag, so I got to attend that, was like late 2020, early 2021. So one of the biggest things that happened was that in May of 2021, we actually adopted a racial equity action plan that lays out a bunch of actions. And then a number of things have happened. So first off, it might be harder to find, but if you search in our legislative calendars or agendas, we have had several update reports that actually list out things that we have done. But some of the things you mentioned have happened. We have an amazing internal staff working group. A really nice thing at Skag is we have these kind of special working groups, and then people get to dedicate some of their time to exploring ideas and topics. And so we have an equity working group. They have come up with definitions. They've come up with a language style guide. There's been a lot of work to help us at every stage of the game think about equity. And depending on what you're doing, how do you think about equity and make that part of what you do? So there is, I can't off the top of my head tell you, but there are reports that go to our committees that are updates on everything in that plan you mentioned, and they're very thorough. There has been work going on. Some of the work we're doing, the grant programs that I mentioned to you, like we're going to launch a call through this REAP grant called the Call for Civic Engagement, Equity, and Environmental Justice. It'll be a $5 million grant targeting partnerships between nonprofits and local government to bring, again, CBO voices to the table and bring these conversations around core policy issues forward. So we're running programs. We're looking at how we do our own work. We're looking at the words that we use. And we are doing regular reporting. So I'm glad. And then, we're going to have another committee. Last thing, we're going to have another committee on racial equity and regional planning. That's going to kick off in September. That's going to meet 4 times and come up with a white paper on how this every 4-year plan that we do, this big long range plan, we're going to talk about how do we make equity part of that, all the way throughout. So those are some of the actions.
Wow. Sounds like a great way for young people at the community level to plug in and provide input and feedback to Skag. So, wow. What an amazing show today. I want to thank Jenna from Skag for joining us today, and our youth council members. Great questions. It's been amazing. I've learned so much, and I actually have more questions to ask. So I want to thank you in the audience for joining us today for another episode of Protest and Promise. I'm your host, Lisa Salazar. Thank you.